Hello my fellow birdcrafters, welcome to the final birds session of Birdcraft for autumn 2020. I'm hopeful that Anno is going to do us a one on his big black and white at the end, but this one is going to concentrate on those migrants that are still moving in November and that you do have a half chance of seeing, although lockdown may prevent you seeing several of these. And many of these migrants continue on even into December, some even in the new year, depending on the driving factors behind their migration. We'll look at those in more detail shortly. Some of the species that we cover may surprise you and some of them be extremely familiar. This is one of our more familiar late season migrants to most of you, although you'd probably be unlikely to actually spot them undertaking migration, because they're principally a nocturnal migrant. Eurasian woodcocks are now arriving in from continental Europe, particularly from the likes of Russia and Siberia. And if you're on the east coast at the moment, you've got a half chance of spotting one coming in off the sea. I know that they were spotted at Hunmanby Gap and Flamborough and the likes only this morning, and I'm talking to you on the 9th of November. And you are possibly going to see one on migration in the very early part of the morning, just the first sort of half an hour of light. You may see one pushing through, but after that they're going to be down in the woods and feeding. Students of migration will know that the woodcock has an association with the full moon period, the first one in November, right at the back end of October, that kind of thing. It's known as the woodcock moon. It is true that they tend to arrive around that period, but it's actually not tied to the phases of the moon specifically. It's just that it's their appointed time of arrival, and that carries on through November, and you can get quite substantial numbers of birds arriving in the UK from Eastern Europe and from Siberia and from Russia. But we also have our own resident birds, and they don't travel very far at all. So it is down to a geographical variation in the species in terms of whether they migrate or whether they are pretty much resident. As ever, the principal driving factor behind migration is food. If you think about the types of food that a woodcock eats, then it's ground invertebrates. It likes to drill that bill into very soft soils, so it tends to be brown earth soils full of humus in woodlands. That's its primary feeding area, although it will go out onto fields at night as well. But it needs to be able to dig away into that ground layer to be able to get to its ground invertebrates. If you're up in Russia and Siberia, any time from now you're basically dealing with frozen ground and the layers of snow, so your food supply is locked away, and that's why they come westwards into that ameliorated climate created by the Gulf Stream. We always associate purple sandpipers with rocky shore coast during the UK winter, and in fact many of you have been with me at places like Ross-on-Sea or up on the Northumberland area, and we've seen lots and lots of these birds on that fantastically seaweed strewn, barnacle encrusted rocky shoreline. And of course that's where they're going to spend most of their winter. But the truth is that we only get a tiny proportion of the number of purple sandpipers that exist in Northern Europe coming as far as the UK in the winter, because these are tough cookies. They're most northerly distributed wader in the northern hemisphere during the winter period, because their food source isn't locked away to the same extent as other species. That rocky shore coastline washed by tides twice a day means that their food supply is still available, and so even in areas where there's barely any daylight, you can still get purple sandpipers existing right through the winter. This is the plumage which I think most of us are familiar with when it comes to purple sandpiper, and in fact it's why it's referred to as purple sandpiper, because there does seem to be almost a purpley sheen to those upper parts, and those yellow legs and the yellow base of that dark bill, which is otherwise rather dunlin-like, is a classic image of purple sandpiper. But just as a contrast, I thought I'd show you what a purple sandpiper looks like in summer, because it's a plumage that we rarely see. And here is that very unexpected purple sandpiper summer plumage. I don't remember seeing it in this plumage in the UK. I think it's because they've left before they develop it, or they don't arrive until they've got into their winter plumage. They do occasionally turn up, of course, at the appropriate time of year to see this, and so if you came across a purple sandpiper in this plumage, you'd have to take a second glance at it and wonder what on earth it was. I photographed this bird in Svalbard a couple of summers ago, but what stays the same is the structure and the shape. That hunched profile, so typical of purple sandpiper, remains, and that rather sort of tucked in neck look about it. All of the features are still there in terms of the structure, and that's why I like you to concentrate on that a lot when you're looking at different birds. I'm not sure if you will think the inclusion of lapwing is something of a surprise. The reason that I have featured this particular bird, one that is so familiar to us throughout the year, is because at this time of year we are getting incoming birds from Eastern Europe, from as far away as Poland, and we will get further influxes of lapwing if you get a close down in the weather, hardening of the weather on the continent. We'll get further influxes into the UK, and so you can go from having just a small number of birds, or maybe a few hundred birds, to having several thousand in a given area in a very short period of time. As I think most of you now know, lapwing is a nocturnal feeding species. Much of the time it will feed in the daytime if opportunities arise, but so often you're seeing large numbers of these birds just roosting together on an open mudflat, or even on a pasture or whatever, and not appearing to feed. And they feed principally at night because kleptoparasitism from the likes of black-headed and common gulls is a real issue for them, alongside similar species like golden plover, and their migrations can take place at night just as well as their movements for feeding can take place at night, and you can literally go overnight from having a few hundred birds to a few thousand in a given area. And I know, for instance, that in the midwinter period between the Runcorn Widnes Bridge and the bridge at Arpley, which is a relatively small area of the upper estuary, we can be talking as much as 6,000 birds gathering in that area. The vast majority of those have migrated in from the likes of Eastern Europe. Only a small proportion are actually local birds in comparison, several hundreds at the most. One of the themes of this particular body of birds that we're going to be looking at here is the fact that many of them, and this includes the lapwing, will continue to move during hard weather associated with the UK. So if we, between now and Christmas, or even after Christmas, get a really hard spell of weather, birds like lapwing maintain a readiness to move and migrate. And they must do that, of course, because if their food is locked away for more than a day or two, they do not have the reserves to get them through that period. So they will usually migrate westwards and southwestwards to Ireland or down into the Iberian Peninsula. In the case of lapwings and golden plovers, they'll start to return quite quickly, whereas other species, once they've moved, they won't return. Blackbirds, typical member of the thrush family, along with their familiar cousins, the fieldfares and redwings, continue to push in from Scandinavia and Russia throughout November, and you will get waves of them at various different periods. Now, the blackbird is one of those birds, because it's got a reasonably good, reliable food supply. It doesn't need to go till it's really quite late in the season, so November is not an untypical time for these birds to push through, and they'll come through in waves. Sit on the east coast at the moment in the dead of night, and you'll hear blackbirds passing over, coming in off the North Sea. On our local patch here in the northwest of the UK, how do we know when the Scandinavian blackbirds are in? I've talked about this before. They're very nervy in comparison to the local birds. Go to your local hedgerow, local park, where you normally see half a dozen blackbirds. Suddenly there'll be 50, and many of them will be nervy, yipping and almost semi-alarm calling. And that's because they're on unfamiliar territory, and they're bit on edge, and so many of them will be dominated by young male blackbirds. You'll notice that as well, with the pretty much all dark bills. Something to look out for, but it's still happening right through November. You rarely see them on visible migration simply because they are very nocturnal in their movements, but one to watch out for. The tripling calls of snow buntings are one of the most sought after sounds of the UK autumn and throughout the winter as well, of course. Snow buntings arrive fairly late. They're still coming into the UK right now, and they're coming from two different vectors. We get birds coming in from Greenland, and we get birds coming in from sort of Svalbard and northern Norway. And they look slightly different, and you can identify the two different subspecies. We can go into that in more detail at another time. Quite naturally, some of the west coast birds are more likely to be from the Greenland area, and the east coast tends to get an awful lot of the Norwegian birds. What I will say is we only get very small numbers of birds on the west coast normally. For instance, at the moment there's a couple around the Leso area. The odd bird turns up on Hilbury. It's quite a few years ago now since I saw the last big group here, and that was at Gronent when there were 50 plus. But go to the east side of the UK, go around to the North Norfolk coast, and you go down the area of Donanook and places like that, and you'll find many hundreds sometimes of snow buntings gathered on the saltings in that area, and that's when you can really hear those tripling calls as the birds are foraging on the seeds on the strand line and the likes. But it's not the only place they occur. You can go to the top of Cairngorm, or you can go onto the top of Pendle Hill in the depths of winter, and you can find snow buntings. These are hardy, tough birds, and they can eke out a living in the most meagre of circumstances. Waxwings are notoriously unpredictable in terms of the numbers of birds that turn up here every year. Some years, barely any, and certainly in the northwest we might be struggling to even see one. Whereas other times we get literally hundreds of them. You know, it's not unknown during invasion times to have several hundred, even in the centre of Warrington or in Liverpool or Manchester or wherever. And they do tend to turn up more urban than countryside situations, simply because there's a concentration of berries left at that time, and their berries are what they are in search of. And the berries are the governing factor as to how many we get, because most of the birds are heading for the Rowan belt that stretches across the southern Scandinavia and Baltic region, and if there's been a failure in the berry crop, that's when we get these erupting waxwings coming into the UK in big numbers. I'm not quite sure what the situation is this year, but I do know that waxwings are already turning up in east coast localities, so we may get at least medium to moderate numbers of waxwings. But this is one of those birds that can move exceptionally late. Once they've exhausted those berries, and it could be even after Christmas, they can pile into the UK in big numbers, and you're listening out for that high-pitched trilling sound. Through the back end of October and into the early part of November, we get influxes of great grey shrikes, and we don't get many. We might end up with a maximum of 100 plus birds here in the UK, although some will pass through to sort of the French and Belgian and other low countries areas. But we do get regular localities where great grey shrikes turn up, and they are usually a week or two behind the birds that are migrating through in terms of coming to their wintering localities. So it's still worth looking out at areas along the east coast in particular at this time of year. Places like Flamborough and Spurn spring to mind as places where they do turn up. But from around about now, you want to be concentrating your efforts on the wintering sites, because they'll be turning up there any day now. It could be Clocainog Forest, or it could be somewhere like the South Forest area in Nottinghamshire. We have very few localities, reliable, regular ones, in our bit of the northwest, but normally they're associated with large areas of clear fell in pine woodland areas, or they associate with heathland areas. Now, we have very small patches of heathland in our bit of the world, but that's where I concentrate your efforts. We're going to concentrate in the next couple of slides on two very small warblers. They're both late season migrants, and here's one I'm pretty sure you weren't expecting me to cover. It's Hume's leaf warbler. It looks rather like a yellow-browed warbler with a rather dull head pattern and a rather dull back. The green is not quite so sprightly in its coloration, and it is a latter half of October, beginning of November bird. And if you're seeing a yellow-browed warbler now, take a second look at that bird, because there is an increasing chance that instead of being yellow-browed, you're actually looking at Hume's leaf warbler. It has a subtly different call, and I'll play that for you now. One of the things about Hume's leaf warbler is it's quite late arriving here because it's come from so far east, but it also has a propensity to overwinter here in very small numbers. But any yellow-browed warbler that you think you've seen from now right through the winter is very, very high chance it's actually a Hume's leaf warbler, so take a second look. Barely bigger than a goldcrest, Pallas's leaf warbler is hyperactive. It's characterized particularly by its hovering habit, picking and gleaning insects from the undersides of leaves. And this particular photograph by Elliot Monteith, a birder from Cheshire, really shows that in action. It's very much more yellowy in the supercilium and that beautiful yellow stripe on the crown, and also you've got the yellowish stripes in the wing, and of course you've got that beautiful little winking yellow rump. It's also nicknamed the seven-striped sprite for very good reasons, because it's so full of stripes. It's a gorgeous little thing, hyperactive as I mentioned. Look out for it, particularly at this time of year, on any sycamores that are left with a substantial amount of leaf in. Any warblers are going to focus on those right now because that's where the aphids are. And you might get chiff-chaffs up there, but it could very well be a Pallas's warbler because they are late October through to mid-November, that sort of time. And we do occasionally get overwintering Pallas's warbler as well. Water pipits are a late season migrant from mid-October, even still arriving through to mid-November. You will be seeing them at localities where there is fresh water normally. They seem to hang around areas where there's wet. They've come from sort of the Alps and other localities like that, coming westwards rather than sort of southerly migrant, and they look subtly different from rock pipit, much paler underneath, far more sort of grey and white rather than that sort of darkish brown and smudgy. Their breast markings are a little bit clearer, and the white striping on the wing is white edged and not sort of dull grey brown. They have a subtly different flight call, but it's still effectively like a Weast like rock pipit call, because they are very closely related to rock pipits. Every year when I'm down at Hale Head watching birds migrating through, particularly when the redwings start to push through, my thoughts turn to hawfinch. And I know that in the last day or so, at least 5 different hawfinches have passed through Hale Head. So this is the time of year right now when hawfinches are moving. They're very distinctive, big, thick-headed finches with those squared off wingtips and that big white line running through the wing like a translucent patch, and the very short tail is also very distinctive. The calls, of course, are quite distinctive too, a loud sort of spit call which travels a long way and you can hear from some distance. They have a different way of flying to most other finches, almost like a flurry of wing beats and then a very heavy, ponderous sort of decline into a bounding flight, but in these fast wing beats again. They often mix up with the redwings, and that's how to spot them, I think, as you're watching them in the next few days. In a northwest England context, I think woodlark is one of those forgotten migrants simply because it's such a scarce bird in our part of the world. But pretty much every woodlark I've ever seen in the northwest has been a bird on migration, usually in the latter half of October or in early November. It's also been at my favourite locality of Hale Head that most of them have been spotted. And they're so distinctive in flight, you know, they've got this sort of big wing compared to the rest of the bird, even bigger proportionately than you see with skylark. Big squared off wingtips, very short tail, much shorter than you see on skylark, and they've got a rather looping way of flying. And of course, if you're hearing the Tululi type call as well, that is a real bonus. But you don't really need to see that, just because even against a group of skylarks, they're just so distinctive in flight. Look for that short tail. That's the real thing that will pick your eye first of all. So this is not meant to be about rarities really, but I just wanted to point this out. If you do happen to see a wheatear in November, really do give it a second glance, because it's half a chance it's not actual northern wheatear. As much as any other bird turns up in November, desert wheatear, in terms of wheatears, is a real November bird, and it does tend to be coastal, usually sand dune sort of areas. That's where it turns up, because it's looking for the most similar habitat to the one that it frequents in its home range. So if you happen to see a wheatear as you're walking over Ainsdale Dunes over the next few weeks, blimey O'Reilly, you might be looking at a desert wheatear. Many ducks are on the move at the moment. Their migration periods can start in the September period, but they will go on for a long time, and some don't start till quite late, and long-tailed duck is one of those. Long-tailed ducks are typical sea duck. They move a long way, coming down from the Arctic ice edge on their migration southwards, and the UK is pretty much the end of the line for long-tailed duck. We get much higher concentrations on the east coast, particularly up in north east Scotland, around the Dornoch Firth, Loch Fleet area. It's a famous area for long-tailed duck. You get smaller numbers along the east coast, down sort of Spurn and down towards Cley and that sort of area. But on the west coast, they're relatively scarce. You get birds turning up periodically at inland waters. Shottick Lake is a classic one, as are the things like West Kirby Marine Lake, and also the Marine Lake up at Southport. You'll get the odd bird turning up. The largest flock I ever saw was about half a dozen birds off the Blackpool area many moons ago. But long-tailed duck is very much a bird of the later part of the migration period, so it's one to be looking out for now. It migrates at night, as do most of the ducks, and so you'll just suddenly be scanning a water in the morning, there'll be a long-tailed duck. It's usually a juvenile or female type rather than the resplendent males. At the same time that long-tailed duck is beginning to appear in the UK in numbers, then velvet scoter is doing likewise, coming from similar vectors. It's also going to get mixed up in flocks of things like common scoter, which are far more abundant. Again, it's more common on the east coast, but we certainly do see them in certain small numbers, sometimes in up to a dozen or more birds, might be mixed up with the flocks of scoters off Landulas, for instance. But if you go to parts of the east coast, then you can see flocks of 40 plus velvet scoters off places like Cley and further up the east coast. Velvet scoter is a relatively easy bird to pick out, even amongst a big flock of common scoters. That big white panel on the inner rear edge of the wing is an absolute giveaway compared to the dark winged appearance of common scoter. But if the bird's on the actual water itself and not flying, look for that ski slope face, which is very different in profile to the round-headed features of the common scoter. Tundra bean geese, alongside tiger bean geese, are not common in the UK. There are relatively small numbers that arrive annually. There's no regular flocks of tundra bean anywhere in the UK, but they tend to get mixed up in pink feet and other geese, other grey geese. But they vary in numbers from year to year, and of course the timing varies as well, because their main area where they're wintering is from southern Scandinavia right down through the Low Countries, and it's really weather conditions over there when it hardens, and if we get early frosting, it'll drive birds across into the UK. So the majority end up turning up in localities like Norfolk and up in the northeast of Scotland, but we do get birds over on the west coast, and of course you're always going to be focusing on localities like Martinmere and Southport, any of the South Lancashire mosses as the places to look for. A much bigger build in terms of the actual build profile than pink-footed goose. Obviously it doesn't have pink feet, it has orange and yellow feet, and there isn't as much contrast in the neck and the breast area in terms of the darkened head and neck. So these are things to look out for. If you're really good, you might be able to pick out the fact that the call is a little bit deeper sounding, and it has a thing called the grinning patch on the bill, which is more obvious than you'd ever see on pink feet. So Russian white-fronted goose is a bird that still winters in the UK at regular localities, Holcombe Marshes for instance, and certainly the Slimbridge area, the Dumbles on the Slimbridge grasslands, well known for them, and a few other localities besides that. But their numbers are reducing quite considerably in recent years because this bird is undertaking a thing called short stopping. This is a feature of many of the geese and swans, and it's because there is a warming of the climate. It seems to be that our area is right on the edge now where the normal wintering range is, whereas previously it was quite an important wintering area. Most of the birds now don't get any further than the Low Countries, and are even further east than that, because most of them of course breed further east. And why would you travel any further than you need to if the conditions allow? So birds are undertaking this thing called short stopping. Russian white fronts have rather pinky bills compared to the Greenland white fronts. They're a slightly paler looking bird than Greenland white fronts, and as you say, you can see them in places like Slimbridge still, where the flocks get to around about 200 these days. Previously you would have several hundred birds, 400 or 500 or more there, so the population is more than halved in the last couple of decades. Buick swans don't begin to arrive in the UK until really quite late in October, and more it seems to be November before they really get to us in any numbers, and they'll not reach their peak of population towards the end of November. They're coming from a long way, you know, just west of the Urals is where their source of their migration is, and when they get to us we need to be pretty grateful, because these days it's another bird that's indulging in short stopping, and our population has dropped and dropped and dropped of late. 40 years ago there were just as many Buicks at Martinmere as there were whoopers, and it's now completely disappeared as a regular wintering bird at Martinmere. You're lucky if you see one when you go there these days. You still get them on the Ouse washes. You can still get them down at Slimbridge, but again the numbers have dropped dramatically there. Rarely more than 100 birds are wintering now. If we get hard winters, then they push across from the Low Countries where a majority of them are short stopping. But we don't get many hard winters now, so the occasions when we get the big numbers have really dropped and dropped and dropped. And this is a bird that we could well lose in our lifetimes. Comfortably within a decade or two, this could become a really scarce, really rare wintering bird in the UK. I said earlier that the population that comes to us breeds around the Lena River west of the Urals. You can see that from here, and you can see that the thickest line is actually heading down to the Low Countries. That's where the majority of Buick swans tend to winter, although with the ameliorating climate even they're seeing dropping numbers now. Because we were more maritime and less continental influence, we would be a refuge for Buick swans, but the changing climate is so dramatic and so rapid that we are being affected more dramatically than the continental areas, simply because our temperatures are warming so rapidly. You can see a large population wintering down in the China area, and these are birds that are east of the Urals, much bigger population than the West European population. I mentioned before about our declining birds. Just to put it in context, we used to have at least 7,000 swans a couple of decades ago. These days it's well below 4,000 and going down all the time. And one of the worrying trends is that only something like 8.5% of the birds turning up in the UK have young with them that survive through the winter. So it's not enough for recruitment in terms of adult mortality. So that's possibly one of the factors that might be affecting overall population decline. Little auk is a classic November bird. We do get numbers of them in October, especially if we get some very early northerly storms. They'll pile down into the North Sea, coming down from places like Svalbard. But really, we see that featured more frequently in November. So if you see a big storm coming from a northerly vector and you fancy seeing little auk, you need to be heading for the likes of Flamborough and Filey and any other east localities with promontories that stick out into the North Sea. You've got a very high chance of seeing big numbers. Of course, lockdown is probably going to preclude you going, but hey, if it comes good, we could go and see some, but it's going to be next year, I think now. Certain birds have a bit of a cachet about them, and rough-legged buzzard falls into that category without a doubt. Just its simple scarcity is something special, I guess, in terms of a British context, but it's that fact that it's come down from the far north, from the edge of the tundra, and it's come down into the UK in small numbers, of course, most years, and they're nearly all juveniles that have drifted across the North Sea, probably gone off slightly where they're meant to be, and end up wintering down the east coast normally, although birds do occasionally turn up in the west side. And if you see a buzzard habitually hovering in even relatively mild light wind conditions, I'd have a second look at that bird, especially if it's looking rather pale with a big black belly patch and with a whitish rump. Then I think you're going to be on to a winner. It's rare that we get more than 50 or 60 birds turning up in the UK. That's a good year, but every now and again we get an eruption of birds, particularly after a good breeding season and a collapsing the lemming population, and then we can have up to 200 or more turning up in the UK. Again, they'll be concentrated down the east coast, but yeah, what a bird this is. One of the characteristics of rough-legged buzzard is it's very fond of perching in very small twiggy bushes, which is not something you typically see a common buzzard doing. And it can achieve that because it's got rather dainty feet for a buzzard. They're much smaller than a common buzzard's feet, and so it's got rather nimble, deft footwork, which allows it to perch on these rather small, thin, spindly bushes. So if you see a buzzard at a distance looking rather pale and sat in what can only be described as a thin shrub, have another look at it. You never know, you might get lucky and it might be a rough-legged buzzard. Coming from the same vector as many of the rough-legged buzzards, a short-eared owl, it's an open country bird, as you all know. It feeds habitually on short-tailed field voles in the UK, and it feeds on common vole across much of northern Europe. And voles go through this cycle of boom and bust, and you can have years when you've got big boom in the population of voles, and the short-eared owls do remarkably well and breed really well. And that can go on for a year or two, and then there'll be a sudden collapse in the vole population. And in those circumstances, the owls have got no choice but to move, and they can move very large distances. We get lots of birds from Siberia reaching the UK in those conditions. They'll come in off the east coast anytime from sort of early October, but they're still piling in well through November, and they don't start to appear in big numbers in other areas like the west side of the UK, sometimes till the end of November. So you know, you can probably judge if it's a good year or a bad year by going to Parkgate on a high tide. I mean, I've been to Parkgate and I've seen 50 short-eared owls. They've got to have come mostly from Eastern Europe. And so keep your eyes peeled for short-eared owls coming in off East Coast localities, and even here in our area in the northwest, keep your eye on the areas where they regularly turn up. And if you start to see more than normal, then you can be pretty sure that these are birds coming from Eastern Europe. Okay, I'll be honest, your chance of seeing a snowy owl in the UK is pretty darn remote. But every year they do come through, and they come through in the late autumn period. And sometimes they don't even turn up here in the UK until, would you believe, the early part of spring. One of the reasons for that is they're eruptive migrants. So the normal circumstances, they're not going to reach us, but when their prey collapses, and it tends to be a thing called Norway lemming, I'll let you have a look at that in a moment or two, they have to erupt southwards in search of alternative food sources. But I don't think that most of our birds that we get are European in origin. They're more likely to be coming from Greenland and down from northern Canada, because they have the same sort of eruptive behaviours over there. They do seem to coincide with the big eruption periods in North America rather than in the European areas. The reason I say that is because it's sort of tied up a little bit occasionally with gyrfalcon. And gyrfalcons tend to be white birds that turn up in the UK, and the white birds population is over in the Greenland area. And the timing of gyres arriving is very, very similar. So I suspect if we're going to have a good year for snowy owl, in which case they're going to turn up in areas like Cornwall or Anglesey, as they have done in a couple of recent years, rather than in the Cairngorms or up in the Shetland area, then we need to be watching out for what's going on in North America to give ourselves the best chance of finding our own snowy owl. I'm sure you're all familiar with the myth of lemmings leaping off cliffs. Well, that doesn't happen, but what does happen is that Norway lemmings do reach really high densities of population, and when the food starts to run short, the stress of that causes them to move considerable distances, often en masse, looking for new food resources. And that's where that legend comes from. And of course, in those years when there's been massive populations of lemmings, then things like the snowy owls and the rough-legged buzzards, they do very well. And then of course you get this stress building, you get disease running through the Norway lemmings, they crash, and it has all kinds of repercussions for the predators, and that's when they tend to shift ground and they will erupt out of the areas from which they are normally found, and they will erupt into areas where they are less frequently found, and sometimes that place is the UK. As the year wears on, the regular migrants start to disappear, but it's when the gulls start to appear in very large numbers, and we're looking out for glaucous gull and Iceland gull in particular coming into the UK, and their numbers don't often start to build up until certainly November time. And in terms of Iceland gull, they're very often not peaking until January, February next year. So look out now for glaucous gulls at tip sites, at coastal sites where you get big gatherings of gulls, places where they loaf, places where they preen. And this particular bird, it's a photograph not far from a place called Bear Island on the bow of Boudica. And this particular bird is a first year bird, first calendar bird really, probably more accurately. It's a bird molting from first winter into first summer plumage. You can see that extra, like a great blackback, sloping into the forehead, and you can see those big sturdy legs as well, and a relatively long wing. Some of the glaucous gulls can look relatively long wing, but they nearly always have a thing called a step in the wing, which you'll be able to see on the next bird. So this bird is in second winter plumage. It tends to be a lot whiter in second winter plumage than it is in the biscuit coloured coloration of a first winter. If you look closely at this particular bird, the tip of the bill is just starting to go pale, and only the last third is normally dark, and the basal 2/3 is sort of a brilliant pink colour. The legs, again, you can see those sturdy legs, you can see that sloping forehead, but also notice on this bird relatively blunt wings, and then there's a bit of a step after the primaries, and that's called the tertial step. And all of the big gulls, glaucous gull, great blackback gull, herring gull, seem to have a very noticeable step in the wing, and that's what they call the tertial step. This bird, many of you were with me when I photographed this, was at Llandulas a couple of winters ago when we were running a birdcraft day, and you got a good view of this particular bird. And it's a big bird, but this one looks rather gentle in comparison to some that you see, and I think this is probably a female. It wasn't particularly massive. That bill doesn't look particularly massive, and certainly females are a fair bit smaller than males, and I think this is a female. We get most of our glaucous gulls from the likes of Spitsbergen, northern Norway, and certainly from the likes of Iceland, and they're not coming quite as far as Iceland gulls are to get to us, and therefore they tend to be with us a little bit earlier in the season. And maybe 30-40 years ago they were very much more common than Iceland gull, but that seems to have flipped somewhat. I'm not quite sure what the reason for that is, but I see almost as many Iceland gulls now as I do glaucous gulls, if not more in some years. This graphic shows where our Iceland gulls come from to get to the UK, and you can see that the red dotty line is coming a long way from the sort of Baffin Island area, a long way over in the Canadian Arctic, and those birds are the Cumlini race, and they're very scarce in the UK. Most of ours are the Glaucoides race, which is more or less pure white wingtips, and it's coming in from the Greenlandic area, passes through Iceland, and ends up in sort of northern Britain in the majority of cases, and in decreasing numbers as you go further down the UK. Iceland gulls are very biscuit coloured in their first year plumage, but this bird is in its second summer plumage. I happened to photograph it up in Svalbard, Spitsbergen. You can see it's retained some of the feathers, its juvenile feathers if you like, and now the rest of it look very white. And look how sharp and pointy and rather long that wingtip is. It's also rather shorter legged in proportion than glaucous gull, has a bit more of a squat appearance, very gentle expression on the face, and it's roughly a third more black on the bill in a bird of this particular type, and a younger bird looks like it's almost got a completely black bill, just the very basal bit has got a pink in it, so it doesn't have that dipped in ink tip to the bill in the same way that glaucous gull has. It also lacks a very obvious tertial step. You hardly ever see that on a Iceland gull. This is a first winter Iceland gull that I photographed in Aberdeen a couple of years ago. That very sort of biscuity coloured plumage, quite mottly, is very typical of the first year birds for both glaucous and Iceland gulls. So now you're looking at structure, you're looking for the longer wing, longer primary projection, sharper primary projection of Iceland gull. You're looking for that daintier bill of Iceland gull. The dark eye is familiar to both species at that particular stage. The iris gets lighter as the birds get older. If you look carefully at this, what looks like an all dark bill, you'll realise that the basal 2/3 is a bit paler, but it's nothing like that dipped in ink tip that you get on glaucous gull, which is so very different and very distinctive in a first year bird. So we're going to finish with the same Iceland gull that you saw a moment or two ago, with a bird in flight, showing you those creamy white wingtips. With an adult bird, it's pure white wingtips for both glaucous and Iceland gull. A bit of a size comparison with the black-headed gull, which has got the big white flare running down the front edge of the wing. An Iceland gull is noticeably smaller when it's side by side with the herring gull, whereas a glaucous gull is noticeably larger than herring gull. And if you can learn the structures of these birds, despite how similar their plumages can look in all stages of their aging, then it's a real aid to getting the identification right. For instance, the longer pointed hand of the Iceland gull does show up in flight in comparison to the more rounded, shorter handed look of glaucous gull.